The hardest part about building in Parabola happens before you even open a flow. It's not about knowing which step to use, but rather about clearly understanding all of the nuances of the process you're trying to automate. It sounds obvious, but if you can't clearly articulate a process, it's really difficult to automate. Now, you don't need a perfect SOP or process doc, but you do need to understand what's happening to the data step by step. Your bar should be, do I understand this process well enough to hand off to a teammate? If so, you are ready to start automating. The goal of this lesson is to teach you the repeatable framework you can use to automate your work before we introduce the fundamentals of Parabola. The flow framework outlines the most foundational building blocks of flow building and is meant to make the process feel more straightforward and actionable. It has 5 steps, and it starts by pulling in data from all of our different data sources. From there, we can clean that data before we combine it across sources, and then layer on more of our business logic when we transform that data. Finally, once our data is actionable, it's formatted correctly, ultimately we can go ahead and send it off wherever it needs to go. Altogether, we have pull, clean, combine, transform, and send, or PCCTS. This shouldn't feel like a totally new way of working with data, but rather something that systemizes the way that you're already working with data in spreadsheets. Let's take a look at an example for a process that might feel familiar. Take an inventory reconciliation, for example, where maybe we want to compare inventory levels between Shopify, our WMS, and ERP, and resolve any discrepancies. We might get started by pulling in data from those 3 different systems before we clean it, doing things like removing columns, filtering out retired SKUs, and making sure all of our data is standardized so that ultimately we can combine our data based on unique identifiers like SKU and warehouse. Once all of our data is together, then we can transform our data, doing things like calculating discrepancies and filtering for just material variances. From there, we can ultimately send that data off, doing things like uploading correction files and notifying the team. Now, this is obviously an oversimplification, and your process might not map as cleanly step by step, but the framework is helpful for organizing your thoughts and keeping you on track as you build your first flow. Once you can outline PCCTS for a given process, we are ready to jump into the product and start building. The fastest way to build in Parabola is by describing what you'd like to automate in plain language, similar to how you might talk to a teammate or another LLM. I'll go ahead and upload a prompt here that describes a little bit of context about my use case and what I'm ultimately trying to accomplish. Parabola is going to take that context and then come up with a plan for what we actually need to build, asking clarifying questions along the way. First, Parabola is going to ask us to pull data into our flow. Once I've uploaded my datasets, I can tell Parabola, and now it's going to look at the data that I've uploaded and come up with a more nuanced plan for how we are going to clean, combine, and transform our data based on the actual values that exist in our dataset. A few seconds later, we can now see that Parabola added 4 blocks of logic transforming our data directly on the canvas. First, if I look at the chat, it came up with a task list to assign itself tasks that it needed to execute in the canvas. From there, it actually made updates directly to the flow following PCCTS. After we pulled in our data, it went ahead and cleaned or normalized that data. It combined the 2 different sources, and then ultimately transformed it, doing things like filtering along the way. And within each of those steps, we can see Parabola gave us really rich documentation on exactly how the data is being changed. So if we would like to go into a step and ultimately manipulate the logic and give feedback, we can simply tell Parabola exactly how we'd like the data and the logic to be changed. As you just saw, this comes together pretty quickly once you give Parabola the data and context on what you're trying to solve. So the real skill becomes being able to understand what Parabola actually puts on the canvas and having enough data literacy and fluency to actually give feedback and understand the results on your canvas. That's the skill that this course is really going to hone in. Now, since no great workflow is complete without really solid documentation, we also can build documentation directly into the flow beyond what Parabola natively puts on the canvas. For instance, maybe I want to go ahead and add a card, and then we can add specific steps to our card to group processes together that are part of the same group of logic. So for instance, maybe I want to call this pull and clean data. And we can continue to add these types of cards throughout the flow to make sure all of our logic is really well documented. Now that I've added documentation to our flow, it's going to be easier to maintain and hand off over time. I also went ahead and added a visualization so we can see overage amounts broken down by different shipping methods. Now that my flow is complete, ultimately I can go ahead and run this flow, which is going to pull in live data from dynamic data sources and also actually generate that final file. And now, once we have a good working flow, we don't actually need to run this manually every single time. We can come in here and do things like set it on a recurring schedule, maybe every weekday at 8 a.m., or we can set up rules to have it run every time we receive an email. With that, you now understand the flow framework, from pulling data all the way to sending data. We'll continue to use this framework as we build throughout the course, and the next 5 lessons will go deeper on Parabola's capabilities across each one of those categories. Now, before you start the next lesson on cleaning data, make sure to scroll down on this page and kick off the building challenge that we'll use for the duration of this course.